record. And then let me go ahead and introduce our panelists today. Hold on, we have one more person coming in right now. All right, so welcome everyone to today's alum-led career meetup. And we are very, very lucky to have Rebecca here today. And she is an alum. She graduated with her bachelor's in psychology in 1996. And she has agreed to be here today to talk to you about a career in forensics, the expectations versus reality. So if you can, students, please turn on your video cameras so we can be present with Rebecca and show her that we are here to engage with her. And if you feel comfortable, you can type in any of your questions into the chat. We'll have a Q&A at the very end, but I'll let Rebecca take it away.
Okay, sounds good. So it's nice to see everybody. As she said, my name is Rebecca Heinrich. I currently am an instructor of forensic science at Wake Technical Community College in Raleigh. A little bit about my background. I have a degree in psychology with a Spanish minor from UNC Charlotte. I have 2 associates of applied science degrees. One is in criminal justice and one is in latent evidence, which is forensic science. And I have a master's degree in criminal justice from Boston University. So that's a little bit of background about my educational history. And I started a career in forensics. Let's see, I started studying in 1999 and I got hired with my first job in forensics in 2001. I was a crime scene investigator at the Greensboro Police Department, and I also did fingerprint analysis. And I did that for 5 years. And then in 2006, I moved to Raleigh and I got a job at the CCBI, which is the City County Bureau of Identification. And at CCBI, I just did fingerprint work. I didn't have to answer field calls anymore. And I did that for a couple of years and I got promoted to supervisor, and I was the supervisor of the fingerprint unit for about 10 years. And then after 13 years at CCBI, I went ahead and left and began doing independent contractors. So now I'm kind of my own boss. But in as much fun as the contracting is, because I still do it, a full-time position became available at Wake Tech. And I thought, well, forensic science, it's kind of where I belong. So I'm currently working both at Wake Tech and I do contract work for a local police department where I help them in the with their fingerprint backlog cases. So that's just a little bit about me. Let me go ahead and talk about the ideas behind forensics. So a lot of people think to themselves, hey, I think I want to be a forensic scientist. So what exactly does that entail? What do forensic scientists do? What type of education is needed? Those are really relevant questions. Now, forensic science is very broad. So there are forensic science overall, and then there are specialties. And so depending on what you're interested in doing, you kind of focus on your specialty. My specialty turned out to be fingerprint analysis or latent print analysis, but I also had a background doing footwear analysis, crime scene investigation. I did a little bit of other things like chemical work and so forth, but my main focus turned into fingerprint analysis. So that's what I spent the majority of my time doing. Now, what type of education? When I first started, things changed a little bit. So there weren't a lot of forensics programs available, but I was able to find one at the community college. And that's kind of where I was able to kind of get my foot in the door. So it was very helpful, but things have changed. And now there are a lot of programs that are available for forensic science. So you can go and have a lot of options in front of you. Whereas 20 or so years ago, it was a little bit more challenging because it was just starting to become popular. So there's different types of jobs that are currently available in forensic science. Fingerprinting, as you've heard me mention, firearms, documents, trace evidence, DNA, forensic chemistry, and other somewhat related areas like odontology or, the odontology, they're definitely more specializing. I did have some friends that were forensic podiatrists, so they studied the way that people walked and the patterns of the foot. So there's other areas as well. So when you get into forensic science, what exactly you're going to be doing, like what is it like? What can you expect? What kind of advancement opportunities are made available to you? Where would you find a job? And, you know, the big question that we all want to know is how much money is available for these jobs. And so we're going to touch on these questions here in just a little bit. So what would you do? So it tends to be broken down into kind of some main facets, I suppose, of forensic science. You can break it down into chemistry, you can break it down into biology, and that kind of supports the realms. And so each of those will have subcategories within them. And of course, down here you have the psychiatry and odontology, as I mentioned earlier. So you have other areas, but there's generally these main focuses here for forensic science. Under the umbrella of chemistry, you would have things like the forensic chemistry for drug toxicology as well, trace evidence, firearms examinations. Forensic fingerprint work can also be somewhat biological. So there's it could kind of maybe go on both sides. And then you could have things like arsons. My husband is a detective at the Raleigh Police Department. He is a bomb tech specialist. And a lot of what he does during the day is he works with chemistry so that he can learn how to create bombs and disassemble bombs. And he goes to training to learn more about the chemistry behind bombs. So all of that would be applicable under this umbrella of forensic chemistry. So under forensic chemistry, you'd be using various types of equipment. You would be using infrared spectroscopy. You'd be using a lot of microscopes. You'd be analyzing hairs, analyzing fibers, trace evidence, meaning little teeny tiny bits of evidence like glass fragments. Under the database systems for fingerprints, we have several database systems that are accessible to us. We have local database systems. We have a North Carolina state database system. And then we have an FBI database system. So I can access fingerprint records from my local jurisdiction, for example, Wake County. And then I can access records from the entire state of North Carolina. Or if I have a suspect, maybe out of California, and I need to access those records, I can do that through the FBI. So there are various computer systems that you would be familiar with here. For forensic chemistry, crime scene work, there's work that you would have to do in the lab to prepare your chemicals, because quite often you'll be working on scenes where you'll be applying chemicals on scenes. For courtroom testimony, you do have to be able to explain the chemistry behind things that you've done in court. And of course, you're going to have to continue with your education. So even though you have your degree, once you start the field, every year you're required to take trainings and continue in education. And then when you respond to court so that you can testify to anything that you've worked in, you have to explain your background and what training that you've continued to do since you've completed your education. So forensic biology is big part of the forensic biology is the DNA, which is a lot of fun. DNA analysis it's very in some way similar to think about fingerprints. So it's a lot of fun. I enjoy doing DNA. I've not had to do it for casework, but I've had to do it as part of teaching a forensic biology class. And Wake Tech also has a DNA database that we use that we've helped the medical examiner's office on unknown deceased individuals. And what we've done is I've had to learn how to do DNA comparisons with that DNA database so that I can help the medical examiner's office if they have somebody who has been deceased, somebody has died, and they need some identification for them. So I've been assisting them with them, assisting the ME's office with that. So you're going to be using various instruments and establishing different types of analyses. You also have the serology, so you'll be detecting blood, you'll be working with other types of biological fluids. And again, you're going to have to be familiar with references to crime scene work, the biology and crime scene work, be able to explain it in court, and then of course continue with the continuing education. So there are other fields that have forensic applications. You have the anthropology, the bones, pathology, the autopsies, the teeth, the odontology, entomology, all the bugs, which if you're a crime scene investigator, anytime you go to a deceased person call, there's a good chance you might have some maggot activity. So you would need to be familiar with the growth cycle of maggots and the life cycle of the flies, because that could be very telling when it comes to establishing a timeline for the death of a certain individual. So forensic scientists are specialized. They go general, and then they tend to focus on a specific specialty. So entomologists and anthropologists will generally work basically in a university type setting. So either specialists that work at a university, conduct research and assist with forensics, criminal investigations and so forth. And typically law enforcement agencies don't employ an entomologist or an anthropologist in criminal investigations. So most of that work will be done in a more academic setting. For the odontology, you're probably going to have a regular dentist who is specializing with forensic disciplines. So you're not going to have a police officer / odontologist. It's probably just going to be a dentist who knows a little bit about forensics and can assist with the forensic examination. And the pathologists, those are the folks that conduct the autopsies, and they're the ones who would testify to their findings in court. So the forensic pathologists are medical doctors who have to go through the entire medical program and do the criminal autopsy investigation of the deceased, because technically a deceased individual is considered its own crime scene. So this is sort of a crime scene investigator for the dead people. All right, so before we move on, are there any questions about the various aspects of forensic science? Anything yet? Okay, so what are our advancement opportunities? So this is a very good question. I have a friend that assisted me with this presentation. So we were talking, they used Alabama as an example. Typically, depending on where you're going to get a position, you start entry level, which is, you know, like most jobs, you would start entry level as a forensic scientist 1, level 1, and then you can go up on higher levels. So you can have a level 2 and a level 3, and then you can become a technical leader, a supervisor, and so forth. So there is opportunity for advancement depending on what agency you decide to work for. The same is true in North Carolina. I do have friends that work for the state crime lab in North Carolina, and they generally start as forensic scientist 1 unless they are transferring from another lab with another agency and they come in with 10 years worth of experience under the belt, and they can just roll into a forensic scientist 2 role. But generally you start as a forensic scientist 1, you have to get experience under your belt, you have to practice your analysis, you have to perform analysis, and you have to learn how to qualify in court as an expert witness and how to provide testimony. Now I'm just curious, for the classes that you have taken, are you familiar with the differences between expert testimony and non-expert testimony? No? So expert testimony requires that you provide the court with additional information about your skills, knowledge, background, so that you can provide an opinion on the stand. So for example, as a fingerprint expert, I have to go through my entire CV and I have to explain what my history is, what my education is, how many exams I've conducted, so forth and so on. And if the judge feels that I've been able to demonstrate that I am qualified to give an opinion, then he will let me provide expert testimony. Generally, layperson testimony is like, you know, I saw somebody doing this, or I heard he did that or something, and it's not really related to providing opinions. So that's the difference between those types of testimonies. Anytime you do forensics and you have a specialty, you will be required to qualify as an expert, which means you will be vulnerable to things like Daubert challenges. And I'm not sure if you've studied Daubert yet in your courses, but you will if you're going to be in forensics, so it'll come. So then you can move up to forensic scientist 2, all the way up to various levels. You can have additional supervisory duties and other titles like a technical leader, which is somebody who helps with quality systems, or even just a coordinator, somebody who helps with training of new employees and ordering of supplies and things like that. And then at the very top, you can have a director or assistant director. So there's just a flow, and generally you do start at the bottom and work your way up to the top, up to a director, assistant director of any particular agency. So where would I work? Well, that's a really good question here. A lot of folks start with state agencies. They start with state police, they start with State Bureau of IDs, or city or county crime labs. So you'd be working likely more local. So if you, for example, in Charlotte had an interest in doing forensics in Raleigh, you would submit your application to the CCBI, and then you could maybe get in that way. A lot of people, though, are a little bit more, they want to go out and do things other places. I didn't want to leave North Carolina necessarily, but I had friends that wanted jobs out of the state, ended up moving to Texas, Alaska, and so forth. There are crime scene jobs available all over the country. Typically, most folks start at a local lab and they get their experience there for a local police department. then they can apply for a state lab. And if they have any interest in doing federal work like FBI, ATF, that sort of agency, then they move to a higher level federal position. So here are some listings of your federal agencies. I have friends that have worked for the DEA, ATF, Secret Service. I have friends that work at the Secret Service. I was offered a job at the Postal Service, but it would require me moving out of North Carolina again, so I did not accept it. But it's a great agency to work for. So I would certainly, if you are interested in doing forensics and you've gotten a couple years under your belt doing local work, then the next step to move up, there's so many of these positions that are available. You even have positions in like Homeland Security that are federal jobs that are very good jobs. You could also do things like private labs. There are a lot of private laboratories that provide forensic services, and they are contracted out for law enforcement agencies. So for example, if your crime lab is backed up with a lot of casework, that work could be sent out to a contractor, a private lab, and they can help with backlog on private DNA or drug analysis or something like that. And then you have non-forensic labs, and these are folks that are doing like research type stuff, analytical chemistry, and they're folks that are going into more advanced degrees. So you have non-forensic type laboratories. So this is another question that I get a lot. Well, how much do we get paid? So I'm sorry to tell you, initially the starting salary is it starts quite low. Most agencies will start somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 a year to start. Thankfully, the more time you're in there, the more that starts to get better. So when I started back in 2001, I started at $24,000 at the Greensboro Police Department. I was working rotating shifts, nights, weekends, holidays, birthdays, you name it. I was there, and they started me at $24,000, and I thought I was rich. I was like, oh my gosh, that's the most money I've ever made in my life. I'm so excited. And it took a few years for me to realize that, yeah, no, that's probably not going to be the best starting salary, but it definitely got my foot in the door. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed crime scene work so much that it was hard for me to believe that they're actually paying me to do it. Like, I felt like I would do it for free because I enjoyed it so much. So it wasn't the most important thing, the money, but eventually as you go on in your career, of course, you need to pay your bills. So entry level, it does tend to start a little bit lower than I think would be beneficial for getting higher qualified folks through the door. But once you get in the door, the salary does start to get better. So within the first year or two, you get your annual salary raise. If you have a second language, you can get like a 5% for some agencies for that. Depending on your educational background, you can get another 5% on your starting for that. And then a lot of times you get a take-home vehicle. And if that's the case, you don't have to pay for gas. And that's another little boost in your salary as well, because you're not paying for gas expenses. So there are some advantages, but initially I will tell you that it does look a little disappointing with the starting range. It is starting to get better. I know some agencies locally that are starting the crime scene people between 40 and 45. So that gives me a little bit more hope, especially when you're coming straight out of college, that that's what you can use to kind of get yourself familiar with the job and still be able to afford your school loans and pay your bills and so forth. So related to the background, when I started my degree, when I started my career in forensic science, my education, I kind of went a little backwards. I started with my degree in psychology, and then I saw that there were some forensic science courses available at a local community college, and I signed up for those. So I was lucky because I was able to transfer a lot of credits in, and I was able to carry all three of those degrees all at one time, and that was really helpful for me. But at the time, there were no bachelor's degrees in forensic science. There were no master's degrees in forensic science. The best I could get was out of the community college I went to. Nowadays, it's really awesome because there are so many more forensic science programs that are available. And I think that's really great because the more people that we can get into forensic science, I think the better our discipline becomes, especially folks that go through 4-year undergraduate programs, because they tend to be a little bit more focused on getting these positions. So what do I need to get a job? A BS, a master's, a PhD? I would say nowadays, at the very minimum, most applications will say that you need to have a high school diploma, but the truth is, Folks that apply with high school diplomas, they're not going to get callbacks. Folks that apply with just associate's degrees will likely not get callbacks. There is so much competition nowadays that you probably at the very least need to have a bachelor's degree in order to get into forensics of any kind. And nowadays it has become so competitive that master's degrees, though they're not required, you will have 5 people with master's degrees applying for one position. So you could have a bachelor's, but somebody with a master's comes in and they might bump you out even though master's is not required. So there is an enormous amount of competition nowadays to get into some of these positions. So you at the very least will have to have a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree, of course, will help as well. So I would say that at the very least, a bachelor's is going to be what you'll need. I do know folks that have applied for positions with associates of applied science only degrees, and I haven't seen that they've yet been able to get hired into those positions.
Rebecca, could I ask you a question about that?
Yes.
So when you talked about your salary and the salary being kind of low, so the students that have those master's degrees, can they negotiate for a higher salary because they have that master's degree?
It depends on the agency. Some agencies are okay with a little bit of wiggle, but in the government world, you have a pay range and it's set. So if they're going to start you at the lower end of the pay range and you try to negotiate up, they may accept it, or they might find a candidate who's okay with that pay range being where it is. So it is so competitive nowadays. And like I said, though, it doesn't, the first couple years, it seems a little low, and then it starts to build. So it doesn't look attractive initially, but once you get into it and start moving it, then your salary will start to bump and bump and bump, and then you're doing pretty good. It just initially, I think it looks very low to start, which I do hate that, because I do want people to be interested and apply for these jobs, but I think that is a bit of a turnoff. But that's a good question. So forensic science is half science and half criminal justice. If I were to ask you guys if you could define forensic, the word forensic for me, what definition could you give me? What would you say? How would any of you define the word forensic? Anybody? Okay. So forensic science is actually a marriage between science and law. So anytime you're going to do something related to a criminal investigation, it's because it's going to be worked through in the court system. So forensic odontology is somebody who will testify in court to the teeth information. A forensic latent examiner is somebody who's going to testify in court to fingerprint work and so forth. So whatever the purpose is in the forensic realm, it always ends up in court. So let's see. Forensic science is, yes, it's generally, you do have to be familiar with the court procedures, but it is very heavily science-based. So you have to be able to articulate science theories and methods, methodologies, scientific processes, applied sciences versus non-applied sciences. You need to be able to articulate that in court. So it's science and court that are married together, but forensic science is very heavily science related. So it does help to have some chemistry, some biology. I do have folks in the field now that did end up with their bachelor's in chemistry or biology that are doing fingerprint work or ballistics or something similar. Forensic science, and you can have a concentration. And then a BS in forensic science may help, but it doesn't guarantee a job, and that is true. Sometimes it might be a little easier, instead of doing the forensic science degree, to do a chemistry or a biology degree in case the forensic part isn't what you decided you wanted to do after all, and then you still have a chemistry or a biology degree where you can move into something that's related. But these I know that are some community college programs that do offer forensic science courses. Wake Tech, like I said, I'm the instructor for the forensic science curriculum here at Wake Tech. Forsyth Tech is in Winston-Salem, and I believe they were one of the very first colleges in North Carolina to offer any kind of forensics program. That was the program I enrolled in back in 1999. And Fayetteville Technical Community College also has a very robust and hands-on forensic science program. So those are some local community college programs that have some classes available. My forensic science classes that our teach are very hands-on. So we play with the chemistry, we play with the chemicals. Today for my footwear and tire tread class, we were casting different types of footwear impressions from different locations. So there are lots of hands-on type stuff. It's a lot of fun. Here are some examples of some universities that have undergraduate programs. So, and then of course, there's another listing down here that you could go to look for some more information about various types of university programs and kind of like look around and mix and match. And then the master's degree in forensic science, it does make you competitive. It allows for additional lab experience, which is really helpful because you will be spending a lot of time doing lab work. Even if you're a crime scene investigator, you have to come back to the lab with your evidence and you have to process it. You have to know how. And then of course you can do the promotional. You can move up to supervisory positions. And here are some graduate programs that are listed that are available in forensic science. It's so great to have these now available. And of course, I've mentioned some other areas. So you can specialize in entomology and then testify in court. So it would be forensic entomology and so forth. These would require more of a PhD, and that would be more academic based rather than working in the field. Okay, so we talked about some of that. You would have to have the MD. You would have to, in order to do the odontology or pathology, you have to go through the medical training first. Now, crime scenes. Not all forensic scientists work crime scenes, but some will. So having done fingerprint work, but I was also required to respond to crime scenes. I had a fellow that worked with me who was a ballistics expert, firearms expert. He was also required to respond to crime scenes. So some agencies are so small that you need to carry a couple, you need to work a couple different things. And some agencies are large enough where they have enough people to cover these various types of positions. It's going to depend on where you are from region to region. And being a death scene investigator, typically that's out of the medical examiner's office, but it is a job and it is a good job. Those are really good jobs. But you do have to have patience, and a lot of times you will have to relocate because sometimes the positions that you want for the opportunities that you want will be in another city or potentially another state. So I have had friends that have had to shift around to various agencies in other parts of the country, but it's still great opportunities. It really is. Okay, so there are various places you can go to look at some job information for forensic science. Be aware that the forensic science job, you are essentially working more towards the umbrella of law enforcement, and you have to have an extremely extensive background check because you will be working with evidence, you will be handling very sensitive information, you will be seeing very sensitive visual things, you'll be testifying in court, so your character has got to be it has to be non-questioned at all. You have to be as clean cut as you could possibly get. So what are the things that they do in your background? Well, the background investigation can take about 6 months. And in that time, they're going through your entire background and they are asking things like, all right, so who are 5 references? They'll contact those 5 people and they'll say, can you give me 2 or 3 more people that know this applicant? And they'll give people and they'll give people. And for me, when I started, they went so far as to contact some of my high school teachers. So I knew it was going to be thorough. I just didn't realize how thorough. Nowadays, some of the things that are really tripping people up is credit checks. So if you've got any issue with credit at all, now's the time to get that squared away, because by the time you apply for the job, they'll go through your credit history. And if there's anything that looks off with the credit, that'll disqualify you as a candidate. And I've known a lot of candidates, unfortunately, that have lost those opportunities because of credit. The other thing is the polygraph exam. So you will be, even if you're not going to be a police officer carrying a gun, they will put you on a polygraph to make sure that everything you've talked about in your background is accurate. One of the questions that they do ask is, have you ever used marijuana? Well, most people have tried it, and it's okay to say that you have. If you have, that's fine, but you have to be honest. They don't believe you if you say you haven't. They won't believe you. They will ask you on the polygraph over and over and over in various ways, have you used marijuana? Have you tried marijuana? Have you been around people using marijuana? They just want to know that you're going to tell the truth. That's what they want. And if you ever say, no, I didn't do it, the polygraph will tell them whether or not you're being sincere. So they're going to ask you about drug use. They're going to ask you about being around people with drug use. They're going to ask you all kinds of very, very in-depth background type questions. And the most important thing is, under no circumstances can you lie about anything, because they will catch it and then that will disqualify you. So the polygraph has been kind of an issue, people getting through the polygraph. They may ask you about other drugs. And there are some drugs that are automatic disqualifiers, things like opiates, like heroines and things like that, automatic disqualifiers. Cocaine may be automatic disqualifier. Ecstasy and mushrooms, and those may also be automatic disqualifiers. So you have to be really careful, but nevertheless, you get through that process. You just have to be as honest as possible. So that's the entire reference to the past drug use. That's right there. They do tend to be very strict on that. And I bet y'all can imagine why. Not only will you likely be working around a lot of drugs, but there unfortunately have been instances where forensic professionals have delved into some of those drugs and it clearly had an influence, a negative influence on their ability to do their jobs and testify in court, and then all those cases would have to be dismissed. So it's a big consequence here. There are so many positions that are available. They're just farmed out to various locations, and I don't want to say that there's no money to pay employees, but it is hard when you're getting started. If you are able to relocate, I think that really does help you finding a position that you're going to be happy and comfortable with. So some of our realities working in the crime scene and forensics world, it may take a few years to break into the field. So once you start out of college, if you've been lucky enough to get an internship and maybe make some connections with a local agency, I think that's ideal. If you have not been able to do that, I would recommend seeing if you could volunteer a few hours a week, maybe 4 or 5 hours a week at your local police department. Learn how to do public fingerprinting, or learn how to help at the records and file paperwork. Just getting your name in the police department and getting people familiar with you is a good thing, because when positions come open, they'll think about you. And that's what happened with me. I had to do an internship, and I did it with Greensboro Police. And then when a job came available, they called me and asked me if that was something I'd be interested in applying for. So I would definitely recommend maybe volunteering, but it is hard. It's definitely a challenge to get into the field. For crime scene, and even sometimes for lab work, you're going to have to be doing shifts. Lab work is if you have to share resources with other people. You might not have enough resources for both of you at the same time, so you have a first shift and you have a second shift, and so that happens. So you may have to do shift work. For the crime scene world, all weather conditions. It could be hurricanes, it could be tornadoes, it could be rain, it could be snow. You've got to be there. 110 degrees with all your equipment on, you've got to be there. So that's it's not as glamorous, I think, as they make it sound on TV, because you are sweating like crazy and there's nothing, you've still got so much work ahead of you. You've just got to keep going. Rotating schedules are rough. So when I started in crime scene world, I worked 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. for 2 weeks, Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday was off. And then Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 3 12s. And then the following week, I had Monday, Tuesday off, worked Wednesday, Thursday, and had Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. And then I switched to day shift. So then I was opposite. So if I worked night shift for the first 2 weeks, I worked day shift for the next 2 weeks. And that shifting, it messes with you a little bit. So you just have to be really careful with the shifting. Courtroom testimony is something that I don't feel like is really portrayed very honestly when it comes to things like popular culture and television and movies and so forth. Courtroom testimony is so stressful. And if you are not comfortable with public speaking, or you don't have confidence in front of a group, you really have to practice. Courtroom testimony is so stressful. So just be aware of that, because it doesn't seem like that's really portrayed in a way that I feel is realistic. I've had to testify in homicide trials, rape trials, robbery trials, and so forth. Every single time I do it, I get the butterflies in my stomach. I start to get a little shake. I get nervous. I feel anxious. I've qualified as an expert 65 times, and nevertheless, I'm still very nervous when it comes time for court. So I just want to kind of bring that out as a reality. It's not the funnest thing to do. your testimony can keep you on the stand for a day or two at a time. So it is very stressful. For those of us that are in forensic science, here's the difference between sworn individuals and non-sworn individuals. Most of us forensics people are non-sworn. We don't have badges, we don't have guns. And I think there is a bit of a misnomer sometimes when it comes to the crime scene world, is that you're a police officer with a gun and a badge and you can arrest people and process the crime scene. And most of the time, that's not it. Most of the time, they're separate. So I've never been a police officer. I've never had a gun. I've never chased a bad guy down. That's not my thing. That's not me. It's my husband. He's a police officer and that's his thing, but that's not my thing at all. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy, I think, on how that's portrayed, because the majority of the time you have civilian crime scene investigators. The yuck factor. So on TV, things are pretty nasty. It's like, ew. But in real life, it's that times 1,000. The smells are overwhelming. The smells can be so strong that you will smell it for 2 or 3 days. If you have a very sensitive gag reflex, if you are not comfortable seeing some of these things, I would caution you about crime scene work and maybe push you more towards working in a lab. Even a lab, you're going to be exposed to some of this, but less so than crime scenes. I will tell you, I still have memories of crime scenes that I responded to where I've had individuals that had passed away, and it was very graphic. And especially in the summer, if there was a decomposition process that had begun, I can still see and hear the maggots, and I can still get the whiff in my mind of what the smell was like. So I would definitely try to make sure you're aware of just how strong that can be. There is so much work when it comes to lab stuff. You do have slow turnaround times. So you might be working on a case today, but it doesn't go to trial for 3 or 4 years. So that is one of the things that I don't think is also very well expressed. If you work on a crime scene, a burglary, you go to a burglary today, 3 years from now, you might be testifying. And the chances are between the time you responded and the time you're testifying, you responded to 200 other burglaries. So how are you going to remember just that one? So you have to take really good notes and you have to be really engaged, because if you overstate something or mistakenly say something, you can really cause some issues in court. So there is a very slow turnaround time, and you just have to be aware of that. So I've had cases where I've been called for agencies that I don't work for anymore. And I had one homicide when I was working at CCBI that I got called back to in Greensboro 10 years after it happened. So there's a huge turnaround time, and you just need to be aware of that. The work can be somewhat repetitious, especially if you're in a lab setting. It's fingerprints all the time, firework all the time, firearms all the time. It's going to be the same thing. You have to make sure that that's something that you're comfortable doing, somewhat repetitious. And again, I don't feel like that's well represented. As I mentioned before, the starting salary, it can be low. I know on TV it looks really glamorous and you've got like these great vehicles, but no. And then finally, there have been some instances of crime scene people that have responded to scenes and have unfortunately had some issues with PTSD afterwards. I can remember some specific incidences where there was a police officer involved shooting. I responded to a shooting where a friend of mine, his name was Dan, he was a police officer, he was shot in the neck. And we thought he was going to pass away, and thankfully he didn't. But it was kind of traumatic. And so not only was my friend just shot in the neck, I was responding and working on that crime scene. So there have been incidents, and I know nowadays they offer more counseling for things like this, but you would, if you have any kind of triggers, you would have to be really cautious with that, because it has caused some PTSD and crime scene investigators in particular. So here are just some links. Actually, I feel like a couple of these are outdated. I'm going to eliminate the ASCLD lab. The rest of them are still good, and I would actually recommend, there is a website called the Crime Scene Investigators Network, and you just type in Crime Scene Investigators Network. And if you've never been there, it offers you articles, job postings, updates. It's a great website for resources. I would certainly recommend the Crime Scene Investigators Network. If you've never had the opportunity to be there before, I would go through that, explore it, because there's a lot of really good information there. And that's essentially the information that I have for you guys. I tried to kind of get through it quickly. I know I'm a fast talker, but I'm ready to take questions if you happen to have any. Anybody?
Rebecca, you mentioned about your court appearances. I was just curious, like, how many court appearances do you have, like, let's say within a year, or how many have you done total? Could you give us some kind of a number?
Yeah, so you're going to get subpoenaed a lot, a lot. But you're not going to respond to every subpoena because a lot of times those cases will plead out. So you'll probably get at least a subpoena a month, at least a subpoena a month, but you're not going to be testifying every month, depending on how busy things get or how the DA's office decides to work their cases. So for example, there were some years where I felt like I was testifying every month, and then some years where I maybe testified only twice. So my overall testimonies, I've got about 100 testimonies where I've testified in court as crime scene investigator or a footwear examiner or a late print examiner. 65 of those are, 65 of those are expert testimonies where I have provided an opinion about an analysis that I conducted and the results of my analysis. So I've got about over 100 testimonies, but about 65 of those are as an expert witness. What are the questions?
There's some questions in the chat. So Sarah, she typed this in the chat when you were talking about the different education levels. Do you think a BA in biology is okay?
Mm-hmm. I do. And I'll tell you, there's a lot that you can do with something like that. First of all, I think at the very least, a bachelor's degree. If you can go to a master's, that's awesome. But I think at the very least, a bachelor's degree is really a really good place to be. In biology, you can do so much. You could do DNA, you could do fingerprint. There's just a lot of opportunity there. So I know like the first few applications you send out, you might not get much of a response if you're coming straight out of school. But the more that you involve yourself, I think the more chances you're going to have at being able to secure one of those positions. I would also recommend that you do, there's professional forensics organizations that they have student memberships. There's the parent body, IAI, which is the International Association for Identification. They have student memberships and they do conferences all over the country. And every year you can go to these conferences and you can learn from actual practitioners, which I think is amazing. And then there's the North Carolina chapter of the IAI. So the North Carolina IAI also has student memberships, and they have a website where you can register as a student member, and then you can go to the conferences there. The next conference is being held in September in Greensboro, in North Carolina, Greensboro. And it's a great conference. There's a lot of really relevant information for folks that are interested in getting into forensics or folks that are already practitioners. But I think that BA in biology, I think that's an excellent start. I really think that's a good way to go.
There's a couple of hands raised too. Addison, you had your hand raised.
Yes, I did. So I'm actually majoring in psychology right now with hopes to get a master's in forensic psychology. And I actually do live like in the Raleigh area. So do you think taking some of the forensic science classes at Wake Tech would be beneficial for me?
Well, I will tell you the one thing that I figured out when I was on crime scenes is I had to kind of get an idea of how bad guys think.
Okay.
There is, you guys, are you familiar with the Locard exchange principle? Have you heard of that?
I have not.
The Locard exchange principle is a principle that was established by Edmond Locard, who is a French criminologist. And he says that anytime a person or an actor is in any environment, there's an exchange that happens. So the person leaves a little bit of themselves. It could be a little bit of hair. It could be fibers from the clothing on the environment. And they take a piece of the environment with them. So you have this exchange that's going on. Well, the good thing about knowing the Locard exchange principle is it's kind of like the background of crime scene investigation. So you get to your crime scenes and you think to yourself, okay, if I was a bad guy, where would I have entered this house? How would I have approached this? What would I have done here? And you kind of have to start thinking like a bad guy. I was telling my students today, for example, at some of my crime scenes, I had situations where bad guys would take pillowcases. And I asked them, does anybody know why a bad guy would even want to collect a pillowcase? I mean, why would a bad guy think, oh, pillowcase, I'm going to take it? And the reason is because the bad guys use the pillowcase to put stuff and carry it with them from the burglary scenes. So I would always go directly to the bedrooms and I would check to see if we were missing pillowcases, because that told me a bad guy didn't come with a bag ready to take stuff. They were unprepared And so that gives me a better idea of what else I might be able to find. So I'm still looking for that exchange. So I think the psychology is amazing. And I think that if you were interested in forensic classes, our website will display which classes are available. So we do crime scene processing, investigator principles, trace evidence, forensic chemistry, forensic biology. And they're, like I said, real hands-on. But the forensic psychology degree, it sounds amazing. And I think you could do really good work with that for sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome. So I don't see the questions. I don't know if there are any more. I'm sure there's a button I can push that would show me, but I'm not familiar with this format.
Honest had her hand up.
Yeah, I don't know where it went, but
There you are.
yeah, I have a question. How did you figure out what you wanted to do?
You know, this is very strange because I actually started backwards, as I said. I went to UNC Charlotte. I loved it. I got my degree in psychology, and I thought I wanted to be a counselor. I think in my head I wanted to be a counselor, but I knew there was something about counseling that kind of seemed right, but I was more interested in like abnormal psychology. It's like, why would somebody behave this way? Why would somebody do this? Why would somebody hurt somebody else? Why would somebody steal something? Like, that's where my brain went. And I moved to Winston-Salem with a friend, and I was hanging out there, and I saw a big banner at the community college that said, now like new curriculum, latent evidence. And I was like, I don't even know what that means, but it sounds interesting. I figured if I signed up for a class and I didn't like it, then it was just, one class. It was no big deal. The very first class I signed up for was crime scene processing. And it was like, yep, this is what I'm meant to do. This is where I'm supposed to be. So I finished my 2-year degree after my 4-year degree. And that's how I was able to kind of get into the police department, because they wanted a 4-year degree, which I had. And I had the skills from my 2-year degree, and it just blended together so perfectly for me. But it was taking the classes and understanding the curriculum. And the teacher that I had at the time, and she's still a friend of mine, she taught it in a way that it was really engaging to me. And I knew exactly, yep, this is where I need to be. So I kind of needed to see what it was first. I had to test it at the college. But as soon as I did, I was, yep, that's it. I just knew that's where I was supposed to be.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Rebecca, there was a question in the chat from Faith. She said, what would you recommend doing as a master's degree?
Well, back in the day when I was doing my master's program, again, there was no forensics that were available. So I ended up doing it in criminal justice, but I actually think that helped me. So my master's degree is in criminal justice. The reason I think it helped me is because it's a little bit more broad. And when I became a supervisor, or when I started doing administrative stuff, it was really helpful for me in that regard. So I wasn't just focused solely on forensics. I ended up doing a little bit more broad work than just the forensics when I was supervising. But I would definitely recommend, if you want to do a lab job, or if you want to do like a more specialized like anthropology or something like that, then you'd focus on a forensics degree, unless there is something more specific you're interested in. So for example, with the anthropology, you could do a basic anthropology and then take some forensics courses to help supplement it, but you would focus on the anthropology. And I know some folks that have done that and help a little bit in the crime scene world, but they're not crime scene people. They just kind of come in if they're asked to, but that's about as far as they go. So I would definitely say that a master's degree in forensic science is ideal if you want a lab job. If you want to work in a lab, that's the way to go. And for me, because there were none, I did CJ, which was helpful for me because I ended up doing admin stuff at a later point in time. So that kind of worked out in my favor. But it depends on where you want to go. If you want to do crime scene work, then I would say either CJ or forensic science. If you want to do lab work, I would say forensic science. If you want to do administration, there are actual degrees for police administration, master's degrees for police administration. And there's so many different, it just depends on where you feel like you would be best fit.
Rebecca, we have Bryce who's raised their hand and he has a question for you.
Sure.
I was wondering about lab experience, because I've looked on the internet and a lot of places say you need like 3 years lab experience. I was wondering if you get that from the internship or somewhere else.
A lot of it's going to depend. If they put a requirement for a job with a minimum number of years, they're not looking for a trainee. They're looking for somebody from another lab that they're going to try to steal. So a lot of times those positions specifically, are not trainee level. You would have to kind of look for a position that starts entry level. And if it's an entry level position, it won't have a minimum year of requirements, like a minimum number of requirements per year. It will have educational requirements. So it depends on what position you're looking at specifically. But I would say in this case, if you're seeing that it's needing 3 years, internship would probably count maybe just a little bit. Maybe a little bit of volunteer work. If you're volunteering at an agency, that might count just a little bit. But I think from the way it sounds, they're actually looking for people that have gone through training someplace else and are just moving from one agency to another agency. That's how that sounds to me. That's how I would take it if I was looking to apply for a job and it said 3 years experience. They're looking for somebody that's already probably testified in court, finished all their training, and just want to move to a new place.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So do I have anybody else?
Another question in the chat from Faith. Would working as a lab technician be beneficial?
Do you mean lab technician as a crime scene investigator, or? I'm not. So there's field work and there's lab work, and both of them kind of use that title. So you can say, yeah, I'm a field tech, but I process evidence in the lab, or I'm a lab tech where I just work in the lab all the time. I would think any job where you're doing anything related to lab work is definitely beneficial. Even if you're starting at a non-forensics lab and you are getting some experience under your belt using different types of equipment, it's definitely beneficial. It can help get you in the door little by little. It can get you some access to people that might have connections into the forensics world. Once you can kind of get your name out there, it's easier for folks to, okay, open the door and let you in. So anything that you can do that gives you any lab experience, even if it's not forensic experience, but just lab experience. Yeah, one of the ladies that I worked with, she started as a lab technician. She was a lab technician first, and then she became a crime scene investigator in law enforcement. When she was a lab tech, it was for just a private company, and she was just doing some basic lab analysis, but that really helped get her a job as a crime scene investigator. And then after she did crime scene work for a few years, she moved into a lab position. And it started for her as a lab tech that was not a forensic lab job. It was just a lab job. But yeah, if that's what you meant, I do think that's very beneficial as well. All right, do we have any other questions?
Rebecca, could you give us one, could you tell us what is the best thing about your job, and then what is maybe the most challenging thing about your job?
Okay, without a doubt, the best part of my job is I can see the impact the work I do has on public safety immediately. I can run a print through a database system, hit a bad guy, call my detective, say, I got a name for you, and that person will be in jail the next day. And that is very important because those bad guys, and you guys will see this when you're in the field, they don't care who you are. They don't care how hard you've worked for your stuff. They don't care anything about it. If they can take advantage of it, they will. And in my heart, I feel like the job I do protects us. I live in Wake County, and I know the crime stuff that happens around here. And if somebody breaks into my house, I don't want to wait 2 years for results. I want stuff to happen immediately. And so my job, the best part of my job is being able to have that immediate impact on public safety and keep people safe. That's a pretty big deal. And when you get to court and you meet these victims after testimony and they come to me and they say, thank you so much, and they're crying, and you just realize how you didn't see it at the time, but the effect that you have is huge. It is huge. So I could never really, I don't ever want to play down the type of work that we do. And I don't want to play down its importance, because within a day to I can tell you one case, for example, in Cary, we had a homicide where a little man who was 77 years old, he was sleeping in his car. He was getting ready to start his job early in the morning. He was sleeping in his car. And this bad guy was going car to car to car. He was doing larcenies. He was breaking into cars and he was stealing stuff. Well, he came across the car with the little old man taking a nap, getting ready to start his job. at about 6:30 in the morning. And he took out a hammer and he beat the little man to death. And that little man had no ability to protect himself. He was extremely vulnerable and he was killed. And we processed all those vehicles and we got fingerprints from all the vehicles. And my job was to go through all those fingerprints and search them and see if I can find a name to go back to these fingerprints. And I found a name, not just on one car, but on multiple cars, which is a good sign. So I contacted the Cary Police Department after my work was verified. I contacted the Cary Police Department. Within 12 hours, this man was in prison. And, well, I don't want to say prison, in jail. He'd been arrested. And to come to find out, he had just recently been released from jail, from prison, for a homicide charge. So he had killed somebody 15 years before. He had gotten out of prison. He had been behaving for about a year, then started doing larcenies, and now he killed a second person. So now he's in prison for the rest of his life because I came in on a Saturday and I worked those prints as quickly as I could. Immediate impact on public safety. So that's a big deal. The most challenging part is the workload. There's never downtime. There's never rest time. There's never time to organize your stuff. You are constantly moving, constantly, and you're under scrutiny, under so much scrutiny. Any little mistake can be scrutinized in court. It could cost the case. So you have to always be on your guard. I always have to be doing everything to the best of my ability every single time. It's my 10th burglary of the day, but it's got to be the best processing I've ever done, because being able to find that evidence in the low credit exchange principle, it's on your shoulders. So the workload can be overwhelming. There's an enormous amount of work involved. Paperwork, court stuff, evidence collection is just so much work. So I would say probably the biggest challenge is just keeping your head above water and not letting it overwhelm you, because it can be overwhelming.
Okay, great, thank you. Are there any other questions from students? We're coming to the last few minutes. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you, students, for asking some great questions and engaging with Rebecca. I just want to say thank you so much, Rebecca. You've provided a lot of great information, and I think the students really enjoyed, and we really want to thank you again, and hopefully we'll have you present for us again sometime in the future.
Sounds good. I appreciate it. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you for the invitation. That was very nice of you to reach out. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the information and everything.
You're welcome. Have a